The pilot's hands were shaking, not from fear, not from cold, but because he'd just touched something that shouldn't exist yet, something that made every plane he'd ever flown feel like a child's toy. When the American engineers first opened the hangar doors in May 1945, they found a machine that looked like it had fallen from the future. The Germans called it the Me-262. The Allied pilots who flew it called it something else entirely. They called it proof that we'd almost lost. The war in Europe had been over for 3 weeks when Captain Harold Watson got the assignment. Walk into a captured Luftwaffe facility outside Munich, document everything, and if possible, fly whatever's left. He expected wreckage, burned metal, the usual ruins of defeat. What he found instead was a nearly intact jet fighter sitting in the shadows of a concrete bunker, its swept wings gleaming under a single shaft of sunlight breaking through the damaged roof. The ground crew had disappeared. The base commander had fled, but someone had covered this aircraft with tarps, hidden it like a secret too valuable to destroy. Watson had flown B-17s over Berlin, dodged flak over Schweinfurt, watched friends spiral into the channel when their engines caught fire. He thought he understood speed. He thought he understood power. But standing in front of the Me-262, running his hand along its fuselage, he felt something close to dread. The skin was smooth, almost warm. The twin jet engines hung beneath the wings like nothing he'd seen in any manual, any briefing, any dream. This wasn't just an airplane. This was evidence of how close the margin had been. The German mechanics they found hiding in a nearby farmhouse were scared, hungry, defeated. But when the Americans asked about the jet, something changed in their eyes. Not pride exactly, more like sadness mixed with disbelief. One of them, a young man barely 20, spoke broken English through a translator. He'd worked on these machines for 8 months, watched them take off like bullets, watched Allied bombers scatter when the 262s appeared, because nothing could catch them, nothing could outrun them. He said the pilots who flew them felt invincible right up until the fuel ran out or the engines failed, and they failed often, he admitted. Beautiful machines with fatal flaws. It took 2 days to make the aircraft airworthy. Watson studied every switch, every gauge, every control surface. The cockpit felt tight, claustrophobic. The canopy offered incredible visibility, but no room for error. American test pilot Chuck Yeager later described flying a captured 262 as sitting on top of a barely controlled explosion. Watson understood that now. Everything about this plane whispered danger. The engines needed careful handling. Too much throttle too fast and they'd flame out. Too little and you'd never get the thrust you needed. It was a machine that demanded respect and punished mistakes instantly. The morning he flew it, the sky was gray, low clouds rolling in from the west, the kind of weather that makes you check your instruments twice. The runway was damaged, but long enough. Watson sat in the cockpit, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. The German mechanic gave him a final look, something unreadable in his expression. Maybe warning, maybe envy. Watson pushed the throttles forward gently, feeling the turbines spool up with a sound unlike any piston engine, a high-pitched whine that grew into a roar. The acceleration was violent, not gradual, not smooth. It was like being kicked in the spine by physics itself. The wheels left the ground and suddenly the world was moving too fast. The trees at the end of the runway blurred into a green smear. The clouds came at him like a wall. Watson pulled back on the stick and the 262 climbed at an angle that made his vision narrow, made his chest feel compressed. In 30 seconds, he was at 10,000 feet. In a B-17, that would have taken minutes. This wasn't flying. This was something else, something closer to falling upward. His training said stay calm. His instincts said this machine had no business existing in 1945. He leveled off and tried a gentle turn. The response was immediate, almost too quick. The jet wanted to roll, wanted to dive, wanted to do everything faster than a human could think. Watson realized why the Germans had lost so many pilots in these planes. It wasn't just mechanical failure. It was the gap between what the machine could do and what a human mind could process. You had to think ahead of the aircraft, anticipate its reactions before you made them. One wrong move at this speed, and you'd be scattered across a Bavarian hillside before you even understood what went wrong. But there was something else, too. Something the reports and the briefings and the intelligence photographs hadn't captured. Flying the Me-262 felt like touching the future, like seeing a door open into a world where everything humanity thought it knew about air combat would have to be rewritten. Watson understood in that moment, 30,000 feet above the ruins of the Third Reich, that if Germany had built enough of these 6 months earlier, if they'd solved the engine problems, if they had the fuel and the pilots and the time, the war might have ended very differently. He brought the jet down carefully, fighting its eagerness to descend too fast, to burn through altitude like it had something to prove. The landing was harder than he wanted. The nose gear protested, but he was down. He was alive, and when he climbed out of the cockpit, his legs unsteady, his flight suit soaked with sweat, the American engineers surrounded him with questions. What was it like? How fast did it feel? Could we build something like this? Watson looked back at the Me-262 sitting on the tarmac, still ticking as the engines cooled. He thought about the young German mechanic watching from the hangar entrance. He thought about all the Allied bombers this machine had sent down in flames. And he thought about something else, too. Something that kept him awake that night and many nights after. The Germans had built this. They'd pushed past everything the world thought possible. And they'd done it while losing a war, while their cities burned, while their country collapsed around them. What scared Watson most wasn't what the Me-262 could do. It was what it represented. The proof that desperation breeds innovation. That the line between victory and defeat can be thinner than anyone wants to admit. And that somewhere, right now, someone else might be building the next impossible machine. The next thing that would make today's technology look primitive. The next weapon that would arrive too late to save its creators, but soon enough to haunt everyone who saw it fly.
The orders came from the top. Fly them all. Every captured jet the Germans left behind. Document everything. Learn everything. And above all, tell no one outside the program what these machines could really do. By June 1945, the United States had recovered at least 30 Me-262s in various conditions, some barely damaged, others little more than stripped airframes. But each one told the same story. Germany had crossed a threshold. And now the question wasn't whether jet fighters would replace propeller planes. The question was how quickly America could catch up to what Germany had already achieved. Watson wasn't the only pilot assigned to the program. They brought in test pilots from Wright Field, combat veterans from every theater, engineers who'd spent the war studying intelligence reports about German wonder weapons. Each man who flew the 262 came back changed. Not traumatized exactly, more like sobered, humbled. They'd gone up thinking they were the victors, examining a defeated enemy's toys. They came down understanding they'd been fighting an opponent whose technology had briefly surpassed their own. That realization sat heavy in the room during debriefings. No one said it directly, but everyone felt it. The jets were temperamental. The Jumo 004 engines had a lifespan measured in hours, not hundreds of hours like American radial engines. The fuel consumption was staggering. For every hour of flight, the 262 needed maintenance that would ground it for days. The German mechanics explained this matter-of-factly, without trying to hide the flaws. They seemed almost relieved to share the truth. Yes, the plane was revolutionary. Yes, it was faster than anything the Allies had. But it was also a maintenance nightmare, built with materials Germany didn't have enough of, by slave laborers who sometimes sabotaged the very machines they were forced to construct. One afternoon, Watson sat with a former Luftwaffe pilot named Franz. The man was thin, exhausted. He'd flown the 262 in combat for 3 months before his squadron ran out of fuel and aircraft both. Franz described what it felt like to attack a formation of B-17s in a jet fighter. You approached from behind and above, diving through the bomber stream at speeds the gunners couldn't track. You had seconds to line up your shot, fire your cannons, and pull away before your own momentum carried you past. Speed was your only protection, and speed was the one thing the 262 had in abundance. Franz described it without emotion, like a man reciting facts from someone else's life. He'd shot down 11 Allied bombers, hundreds of airmen dead because of his skill and the machine beneath him. He didn't seem proud. He didn't seem guilty either. He seemed empty. Watson asked him if the jet could have changed the outcome of the war. Franz looked at him for a long moment and then shook his head slowly. Too few. Too late. And even if we'd had thousands, the fuel was gone, the pilots were dying faster than we could train them. The 262 was a miracle, but miracles don't win wars. Production wins wars. The Americans flew the captured jets for months. They raced them against the fastest prop fighters, the P-51s and P-47s that had ruled the skies over Europe. The results were absolute. In level flight, nothing piston-powered could catch a 262. In a dive, the jet pulled away like the prop plane was standing still. That information went into classified reports that eventually reached the Pentagon, the White House, the defense contractors already imagining an American jet fighter program. But something else went into those reports too, something the pilots struggled to articulate. Flying the Me-262 changed how you thought about air combat. In a prop plane, you felt connected to the air. You felt the engine's power transmitted through the stick, heard the roar and felt the vibrations. In the jet, you felt disconnected, isolated. The turbine screamed behind you, but the cockpit stayed eerily quiet. The speed was so great that the ground blurred into abstraction. You stopped being a pilot and became something closer to a passenger, a brain trying to keep pace with a machine that wanted to outrun human reflexes entirely. Watson wrote in his final report that the Me-262 represented a philosophical shift, not just a technological one. Piston fighters were extensions of the pilot's will. Jets were autonomous forces that pilots directed more than controlled. The distinction mattered. It meant that future air combat would favor the pilot who could think fastest, process information quickest, make decisions in fractions of a second. The era of the romantic fighter ace was ending. The age of the systems operator was beginning. By late summer, most of the captured jets were grounded. Parts were impossible to get. The engines had burned through their lifespans. A few were crated up and shipped to the United States for further study. Others were left to rust on abandoned German airfields, monuments to innovation born from desperation. Watson flew his last sortie in an Me-262 on August 3, 1945. The same week the world learned about atomic bombs and Japan's surrender. The jet age and the nuclear age arriving simultaneously, twin heralds of a future nobody fully understood yet. He brought the jet down one final time, shut down the turbines, and sat in the cockpit listening to the silence. The war was over. The Allies had won. But Watson couldn't shake the feeling that they'd gotten lucky, that if the Germans had started their jet program 2 years earlier, or if the Allies had been 6 months slower, the outcome might have been catastrophic. Victory, he realized, wasn't just about courage or strategy or even industrial might. It was also about timing, about the narrowness of margins.
20 years later, Watson would watch jets scream across the sky and remember that gray morning in Bavaria when he first pushed the throttles forward on a machine that shouldn't have existed. He'd see the space race, rockets carrying humans beyond the atmosphere, and remember that feeling of barely controlled power beneath him. And sometimes, late at night, he'd wonder about the German engineers who built that revolutionary jet. Wonder what they could have achieved if their genius had been aimed at something other than war. Wonder if humanity's greatest innovations will always be born from its darkest moments. The Me-262 wasn't just a plane. It was a warning, a reminder that technology advances whether we're ready for it or not. That the next impossible thing is already being designed somewhere by someone desperate enough or visionary enough to push past what's thought possible. Watson carried that knowledge with him until the day he died. And every pilot who flew that captured German jet carried it too. The memory of touching something that felt less like an airplane and more like a glimpse into a future we weren't sure we wanted to reach.